They called it the Second Rome, a great city astride Europe and Asia. And its vast empire, which would preserve Greco-Roman culture and transmit it to the West when Rome itself lay in barbarian hands. The Byzantine Empire, this time on the Western tradition. The power of the Western Roman Empire lasted 5 centuries. The power of Babylon and Assyria rather less than that. The Persian Empire took 3 centuries before Alexander put an end to it, and the British Empire lasted about 2 centuries. But the Byzantine Empire survived longer than any of these. Only Egypt lasted longer. The word Byzantine comes from Byzantium, the old Greek city on the Bosphorus that became the site of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines called their lands Romania, and they called themselves Romans, Romaioi. And their empire remained for many centuries the only civilized power in all of Europe. Just as we attribute the creation of the Roman Empire to Augustus, so we can attribute the creation of the Byzantine Empire, which was the Second Rome, to Constantine the Great, who transferred the empire's capital to the city that would bear his name, who made the empire a Christian empire, and the emperor into the anointed of the Lord. The Byzantine Empire copied and preserved much of the classical art and literature and Roman law which we have inherited. And the empire's importance to Eastern Europe is even greater because it was Byzantine missionaries and Byzantine prestige that civilized and Christianized the Eastern Slavs from the Baltic to the Balkans and beyond. For example, this 11th century enamel medallion was made in Georgia, which is now part of the Soviet Union. Constantinople was inaugurated as an imperial capital of the Roman Empire in 330, and it survived until 1453, when the Turkish conquest put an end to one imperial tradition and began another, renaming the city Istanbul. But it was a remarkably long run while it lasted. During this more than 1,000 years, the Byzantines conquered and lost several empires. In the 6th century, a Balkan empire was recaptured from the Goths. A Mediterranean empire was built up after a long, hard-fought war, also against the Goths. And an African empire was reconquered from the Vandals. But the African empire and much of the Middle East were lost to the Arabs in the 7th century. Most of the Mediterranean empire was lost about the same time, with the remainder going in the 11th century, and the Balkan empire was lost and partly regained in the 9th century. The trouble with Constantinople, represented here as a classical figure, was that her tradition was Roman. You can tell this is Rome because of her helmet and military dress. Constantinople's imperial vision was that of the old Roman Mediterranean Empire, which it was not well placed to run if you bear in mind the problems of time and scale that had proved too much even for Rome to handle. The average ship would take a week or two to cross the Mediterranean from north to south, 15 days from Constantinople to Alexandria. But it could take as much as 2 or 3 months from east to west, for example, from Crete to Carthage or Cadiz. So there were considerable obstacles to the realization of the Byzantines' imperial ambitions. In the 6th century, when the Emperor Justinian, seen here, regained Italy from the Goths and North Africa from Vandals, he exhausted the resources of Byzantium while also ruining Italy's economy and killing a large part of its population. So it was no accident that the Byzantine Empire reached its high point when it became smaller and more defensible between the 8th and 12th centuries. It had survived new waves of barbarian invasions, but equally important, it had lost its outlying possessions to the Arabs and the Slavs and had become more compact. Yet, whatever happened to its outlying empire, Constantinople remained what Paris was, what New York is today. The foremost city of luxury, fashion, and culture, also the city of sin, corruption, and material temptation, all of which, however you look at it, is no mean achievement. The city was built on a high peninsula on the Bosphorus, where Europe comes very close to the Asian shore. Astride both Europe and Asia, Constantinople was a crossroads par excellence. It commanded the route from the Caucasus and the steppes to the Mediterranean, and also the route from the Danube Valley to the Euphrates Valley. The Balkans were its backyard. Asia Minor lay just across the water, and beyond that Syria and Mesopotamia. So Constantinople was perfectly situated to serve as the capital of a realm that bridged East and West, that connected Greco-Roman culture with Christianity and with Oriental civilization. And its history is indeed the bridge that links us with Egypt, which it came to rule, and with Persia, which it fought and finally defeated, and even with Alexander the Great, whose title of Basileus, or royal king, the Byzantines borrowed for their own rulers. For centuries, Constantinople was the repository of Greek and Roman culture and of the tradition that had been built up in preceding ages in Egypt and Babylon and Athens and Rome and Jerusalem. Our civilization wouldn't be the way it is today if the city of Constantine hadn't endured to transmit these traditions, to transmit the Latin of Rome and the Greek of Athens, the skills, the arts, the thought, the memories, to the barbarians of the West and to their gradually more civilized successors. So the survival of the city was crucial because it helped to make our past. Perhaps the most important factor in its survival was the conviction that the empire was willed by God and protected by God and his anointed representatives. On the other hand, it was this same religious conviction that goes a long way to explain the traditionalism, the extreme conservatism of Byzantium. If your state is founded on the will of heaven, why innovate? A Byzantine ruler might be dethroned, and God knows enough of them were by murder as shown here, or palace revolutions or riots in the city. But a change of emperor did not mean a change of policy, except in minor details, because to change it would have been something like changing your faith. And so, with heaven's approval secure, the Byzantine sovereign and the Byzantine state were both defenders of the faith. The concentration of all authority in the hands of God's representative like the emperor depicted here, was in itself a great source of strength. In the West, men lived their lives under a lot of different legal systems, tribal law, local law, manorial law, and the law of the central or would-be central state fought a continuous battle for recognition from the countryside, from the provinces, which took centuries and didn't really get settled until quite recent times. Here, for instance, are great landowners from 6th century Italy who were a law unto themselves. But in the East, there was only one law, and that Roman law emanated from a single source, the ruler. Even the decisions of the councils of the church needed the emperor's approval. This is what has been called Caesaro-papism, a political system in which the head of state is also master of the church. And the patriarch, the Bishop of Constantinople, lived in the shadow of the imperial palace. When Constantine died in 337 with his heir far from Constantinople, the embalmed remains of the dead emperor continued to rule the empire through a whole summer and autumn and winter, with couriers reading their messages before it, ministers making reports to it, and courtiers seeking audience before it. It's important to realize, however, that even this macabre image of a ruling corpse had its roots in a long past. It was simply the triumph of the Hellenistic view of the emperor's lofty position, a view which had developed in the East since the days of Alexander, which the Romans had taken some time to adopt, but which the Emperor Diocletian explicitly claimed in Rome at the end of the 3rd century. And it was very useful, because it lent the Byzantine Empire a sort of authority and stability that the old unified empire never had. It did not matter anymore whether the emperor was elected, or if he was born to the purple, or if he seized power, because his throne rested upon more solid foundations than worldly processes could ensure. He was the anointed of the Lord, chosen from birth to fulfill the will of heaven. And since Byzantines believed that promotion to rule came solely from God, the imperial throne was open to everybody, peasant and noble, to scholars and to unlearned men, the only condition being that the ruler should be an Orthodox Christian. Leo I in the 5th century had been a butcher. People in Constantinople used to point out the stall where he and his wife had sold meat. Justin I in the 6th century was a poor swineherd from the countryside who first appeared in the capital with bare feet and a pack on his back. And then one day his nephew left the family village to join him. His name was Justinian, and he became emperor in 527. Phocas, who ruled in the 7th century, was a simple centurion. Leo III in the 8th century was an odd job man. Basil I in the 9th century was a peasant, probably a shepherd from Macedonia. And Michael IV in the 11th century was a servant from Paphlagonia on the Black Sea. But once a man had become emperor, there was no constitutional method by which he could be deposed except a successful revolution. And here again, the fact of success set the seal of heavenly approval upon the man who, had he failed, would have been a mere usurper and would have been punished in the most terrible ways. The Byzantines knew that Jehovah had transferred his favor from Saul to David. They believed that God could withdraw his support from any ruler, and then you would know it, because the ruler would fall. And with this belief, revolution itself was incorporated into the body of constitutional practices. As the German historian Mommsen said, Roman government was an autocracy tempered by the legal right of revolution. Out of 88 emperors who ruled in Byzantium through 11 centuries, over 1/3 would be usurpers, and as many died in violent circumstances. Poisoned, stabbed, strangled, beheaded, starved, tortured to death, or simply blinded, which was considered more humane. As one result, it became particularly important to emphasize the sanctity of the emperor, his distance, his untouchableness. The more vulnerable the emperor in fact, the greater the efforts to make him appear invulnerable in principle. This is Constantius II and his empress, who ruled in the 4th century. This is when the empire is most threatened, in their time and throughout the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And this is when the personal position of the emperor is least secure. This is when the imperial ceremonies stiffen and the distance grows between the ruler and his subjects. A spectacular, megalomaniac kind of drama is devised both to enhance power and to make up for the shortcomings in this power. You can see this if you look at the mosaics of the Emperor Justinian and the Empress Theodora. Stiff and splendid in the midst of their courtiers, their posture reminiscent of the unmoved mover, the highest power in the cosmos. Although it was very important that the emperor should impress upon his subjects this feeling of divinity, which might help to preserve him from an undignified end, it was equally important that he should impress the barbarians, friend or foe. This was rather more feasible because barbarians were less sophisticated. So imagine the arrival in Constantinople of a barbarian chieftain from the steppes, from the desert, or even from the underdeveloped countries in Western Europe. He finds himself in this terrific maze of streets and concentrated humanity. He is taken over by imperial officials who look after him every day, every hour, who show him the sights, and who finally take him to the palace for an audience with the emperor. To get to the throne room, he passes through a sort of palace of the Wizard of Oz, through a maze of marble corridors and chambers rich with mosaic and cloth of gold, through long lines of palace guards in white uniforms, through great crowds of patricians, bishops, senators, and all of this to the music of organs and church choirs, with eunuchs on either side of him holding him under the armpits. Until at last he enters the octagonal room, where this silent, stiff, completely motionless figure is seated on an elevated throne veiled by purple fabrics, purple being the imperial color and forbidden to everybody else. The furniture of the room is very strange. There are golden lions, golden griffins, golden birds perched on golden trees, rather like a sort of glorified mechanical toy store gone wild. And all of this is set in motion by the chieftain's entrance. The animals open their mouths, the birds open their beaks and sing, the griffins whistle, the lions roar and thrash their tails, and meanwhile the visitor has to prostrate himself. And when he gets up, he cannot see either the emperor or the throne. Finally, he discovers that the throne has somehow risen way up, and the emperor is still sitting on it, stiff, painted, but now wearing another costume than the one he had apparently been wearing a moment before, and certainly too far away to hold a conversation. The man is not just impressed, he is befuddled. He is dominated by all this splendor. He agrees to fight for the Roman Christ and for the empire. He will be kept happy by presents, honors, subsidies. He may be given a Byzantine princess in marriage. He will certainly be sent a bishop who is subject to the Patriarch of Constantinople and who will sustain imperial interests. The Byzantines and their emperors understood well that diplomacy is cheaper than war, because when it works, your enemies do your fighting for you. And even when it doesn't work, it helps to buy time. But all of this needed money, a lot of money. In the 3rd century, remember, the imperial administration of the United Empire pretty much broke down. Inflation sent prices rocketing sky high, and the economy of the empire threatened to regress into a system of barter. But then in the 4th century, reform restored the value of money, and taxation was re-established, which could be used to keep up a bureaucratic government. This saved the East, but it couldn't save the West, which lapsed back into a barter economy under its barbarian rulers and grew weaker and weaker because it could not pay to protect itself. The eastern part of the empire, however, was safeguarded by firm administration and stable economy, which bolstered its diplomacy and enabled it to pay its soldiers with gold. The East's ability to tax enabled it to maintain a highly trained army and navy which could preserve the empire. War for Byzantium was a desperately serious business. So the Byzantines kept and developed strategies and practical improvements in a way that barbarians and later lords of the West cared little about. The Byzantines developed drill, they developed tactics, they also developed secret weapons like Greek fire, a petrol-based mixture rather like napalm that could be shot from ships and from battlements. It proved deadly against Arab and Slavonic fleets. And they did great things with small numbers. This medallion commemorates the triumph of Justinian's general Belisarius, who reconquered North Africa from the Vandals with about 15,000 men, and Italy with only about 8,000. By the 10th century, the grand total of Byzantine military forces was at most 140,000 men. But there was one institution that was even more important to the survival and the unity of the Byzantine Empire than the army, and that was the church we now call Greek Orthodox. Greek because Byzantium had been an ancient Greek city and its Successor Constantinople inherited its Hellenistic traditions. Orthodox, because it alone in its own eyes represented correct doctrine. The Church's faith became the bond that in large measure took the place of a common nationality. And its position in society was crucial to the state in ways that the Latin Church in Rome never was. In the United States, with our constitutional separation of church and state, it's sometimes hard to understand just how powerful a political force religious institutions can be. But in the Byzantine Empire, the church was one with the state, and it prospered when the empire prospered. Now that made it very different from the Latin Church, which never quite identified itself with the Roman state. At first, of course, it was persecuted, but even when it became the state religion, it tried to stay autonomous. When the Eastern Church sent out missionaries like these, however, they were also ambassadors of the Byzantine state, and the pagan rulers they converted became political allies of the empire as well, or at least it was hoped they would so become. The best example of this religious diplomacy occurred in the 9th century when two missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, later canonized, produced a script and liturgy that would be adopted by the Bulgarians and by the Slavs of the Balkans. In the 10th century, the Slavs of Russia adopted them too, and that is why today the script of the Russians is Cyrillic, or if you like, Cyrillic. The other side of the coin, however, was that religious dissent in the Byzantine Empire easily turned into political division and vice versa. The political stability of the empire, even its unity, were affected by theological disputes. One sometimes feels that theological disputation was the Byzantines' favorite sport, more so even than chariot racing. But some of these disputes were going to have dire long-term results. One of them was a long-standing difference between the Orthodox view that Christ had two natures, human and divine, and the rival belief which held that Christ had no humanity, only one nature, which was totally divine. The people who believed in one nature were called monophysites, literally one-naturists. Monophysites were particularly numerous in Egypt and Syria, where their different vision of Christ came in very useful to affirm political differences against the central government in Constantinople. And so the dispute went on for a couple of centuries, and it became particularly bitter in the 7th century, just when unity was needed most, as a new and explosive force burst onto the world stage. In the Arabian Peninsula, a prophet had arisen. His name was Muhammad, and in just a few years, he united the fierce, warlike Arab tribes into a confederation dedicated to the spread of a new religious message, the message of Islam. Muhammad's revelation was that there was only one God, Allah, and Muhammad was his prophet. There had been other prophets, Moses, Jesus, but Muhammad said he was the last and the only one to reveal the whole truth of what God was about. The religion he preached was simple and accessible. A strict monotheism with none of the complications that Christians had developed, a straightforward ritual rather similar to that of the Jews and related to cleanliness and hygiene, the emphasis of basic virtues like courage, charity, hospitality, and the important promise that those who fell in battle for the faith went straight to a paradise which the holy book of Islam, the Quran, described in detail, and which sounds a lot more fun than the paradise of Christians or Jews.
Combined with military force, the message of Islam proved very potent indeed. In the 10 years before his death in 632, Muhammad had united all the tribes and cities of Arabia. By 644, 12 years after his death, Egypt and Libya had fallen to Islam, as well as Syria, Iraq, and Persia. By the time the century ended, Arab armies had overthrown what was left of the Persian Empire. They had laid siege to Constantinople, and within another 15 years, they had spread from India to Spain. Part of the secret of their success was that they were not quite as barbaric as they seemed. Arabia had long been a crossroads for trade in spices and perfumes and slaves. And Muhammad himself was a merchant in Mecca, which was a great merchant town, and found his first support in Medina, another merchant town. Muhammad also knew a lot about Jewish and Christian beliefs. Here he is depicted riding next to Jesus, which shows that the Arabs were not so isolated as one might think. Another part of Arab success was that they were Semites, speaking a Semitic tongue close to the Aramaic spoken by common people from Iraq to Palestine. Perhaps the most crucial factor was their relative religious tolerance. This is a scene from a Passover service held in Spain under Muslim rule. Muslims did not try to exterminate those who believed in Judaism, Christianity, or anything else. They simply asserted a higher revelation which made Muslims the chosen people, entitled to special privileges on earth and exclusive access to heaven, and which left non-Muslims as second-class citizens, tolerated but a bit despised.
Muslims didn't have to pay taxes, only non-Muslims paid taxes, and this was a strong argument for conversion, of course, and an equally strong argument for Muslims to tolerate the non-believers around them. And while non-Muslims had to shoulder the entire tax burden, they paid no more, often less, than they had done before being conquered. Moreover, if they were religious dissenters at loggerheads with Constantinople and with the Orthodox Church, they invariably felt freer to worship in their own way under Muslim rule than they did under Byzantine rule. This is the story of the Coptic Church in Egypt, Monophysites who preferred Muslim tolerance to Orthodox persecution.
But Muslim tolerance was not just about taxes and non-believers. An attractive characteristic of the Arabs was that they were culturally tolerant, curious, ready to adapt traditions they found in the civilizations they conquered. They took over the Persian and Byzantine forms of government, complete with bureaucracy and absolutism, but they also preserved the cultural heritage of Greece and Persia, philosophy and geography, astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, and in many cases they improved on them. Arabic became what Greek had been to the Hellenistic world, the common language of an Islamic world that ran from the East Indies to Spain. It created a sort of international network of letters and science, where writers in Spain could affect thinkers in Persia, and where philosophers from India could read what was written in North Africa. The Arabs transmitted the works of Aristotle, who is depicted here in a 13th century manuscript, and the works of Plato, when both were forgotten in the West. The Arabs picked up Greek medical science as perfected in Persia and passed it on. This, for instance, is a doctor preparing a batch of cough syrup. And Arab medicine was sufficiently in advance of European medicine that when the first European medical school was founded at Salerno in Italy in the 10th century, it was staffed by Muslims. Their architecture influenced Western designs, especially the minarets of their mosques, which are reflected in our bell towers. They borrowed from the Hindus what we now call Arabic numerals. They introduced a Chinese invention, paper, and we can see by the words we've taken from them, algebra, alcohol, zenith, zero, how much they affected our sciences as well. Militarily, Islam was checked in the 8th century. In 718, the Arabs were stopped in the east after a year-long siege of Constantinople, and in 733 they were driven out of Gaul by the Franks. But the influence of their civilization was going to affect backward Europe for centuries to come. Another instance of religious conflict with long-range effects was a long and bitter struggle dividing Christians between those who worshipped icons, that is, images like these of Abraham or David, and those who wanted to ban icons and were known as iconoclasts, literally breakers of images. In this Byzantine manuscript, a group of bishops expresses strong disapproval of an image of Christ. Now, icons depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and a variety of saints had become tremendously popular objects of worship related to healing, protection, and all kinds of miracles. Here again, a profound cultural difference divided East and West. It was the eastern provinces, closer to Jewish and Muslim traditions, which bred the greatest opposition to the worship of icons. The West, meanwhile, regarded Eastern iconoclasm as sacrilege and heresy. This issue divided the empire for over 100 years, between 726, when one Byzantine emperor, Leo III, ordered all icons destroyed, and 843, when the icons were finally reinstated for good. It also quite literally helped to divide Christendom between Rome and Constantinople, because the Patriarch of Constantinople stood for iconoclasm, while the Pope of Rome stood against it. This meant that after the 8th century, the Roman popes no longer looked for support from Constantinople against the barbarians. Instead, they turned to barbarians for support in the religious struggles against Constantinople. Actually, the formal break in Christendom was going to come in 1054, when Pope Leo IX in Rome and Patriarch Michael Cerularius in Constantinople excommunicated each other. That was when the political division that had been growing between East and West for centuries was confirmed by a religious division which persists today.
Officially, the break came because when Romans and Byzantines stopped disagreeing about icons, they disagreed about whether priests should marry or wear beards, and whether the bread in the sacrament should be leavened or not, and whether the creed, the official statement of the most essential articles of faith, whether the creed should have the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son, or from the Father through the Son. Behind the doctrinal differences, however, lay the immemorial contempt of the Latin for the Greek, and the disdain of the legitimate empire in Constantinople for the upstart empire in the West, which was now run by barbarians. And behind that, there must have been, too, the simple fact that the empire was no longer united in any way, that its parts had become quite different, with one speaking in Latin and the other in Greek. So the Mediterranean world, which had once been knit together by a bilingual culture, was now split into two halves, which could no longer understand each other.
The only thing that East and West had in common by the 8th or the 9th century was the agreement that Constantinople was the city, the great marketplace, the focus of the Christian and the trading world. Constantinople had paved streets that ran for miles. It was lined by arcades full of countless shops with running water in every quarter, with a hippodrome greater than the Colosseum, and 4 gilded horses above the emperor's box, which were later stolen by the Venetians to adorn the facade of their basilica. And above everything, the wonder of Santa Sofia, the great cathedral which had been rebuilt by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century after the previous church had been burnt down in a riot.
The harbor was crowded, the bazaars were full of people and goods from all over the world. As one visitor explained in 1161, great stir and bustle prevails in Constantinople in consequence of the conflux of many merchants who resort there both by land and sea from all parts of the world, from Babylon and Mesopotamia, from Media and Persia, from Egypt and Palestine, from Russia and Hungary, and from the West.
You can get a vague idea of what it was like by looking at the site today, or by looking at architecture which imitates the Byzantine style from the domes of churches in Moscow to this one in Périgueux in France, and by looking at Venice, where St. Mark's is the 11th century copy of a 6th century Byzantine church, and where many of the palaces are touched by the Byzantine style. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, when Constantinople was the wonder of Christendom, the West was backward. It didn't have much to offer the East in exchange for its silks and spices. A bit of iron and timber, slaves who were mostly captured or kidnapped Slavs, hence the term slave, and eventually woolen textiles which would improve the balance of trade. But for a long time, the Byzantines despised Westerners as barbarians, which they were, and as poor barbarians, which was worse. And the Westerners despised Byzantines as effeminate, devious, and wicked. They ate fancy food, they wore fancy clothes, they washed far too much, and the women painted themselves, and the men hired other men to fight for them. So Westerners looked down on Byzantines, but they also envied their riches. And this attraction which drew them to the glamour and the splendor of Constantinople was dangerous, because if all roads led to the city, to New Rome, then everybody was likely to wind up there with fair intentions or foul. The Byzantine Empire had already been beset by a number of pressures, from the Turks in Anatolia, the Normans in Italy and Greece, and especially the Italian sea powers, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. Finally, in 1202, Venice convinced some 30,000 crusaders who were unable to pay for transport to Muslim Egypt to conquer Venice's rebel Christian port city Zara instead. The pirate crusaders then moved on to Constantinople with the flimsiest of excuses, and they took the city in 1204. This is an artist's rendering of the event done a long time later. And this is Venice, which was the primary beneficiary when the Byzantine Empire, its riches and trade fell into Western hands. It was Venice that went on to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. And the shadow of the Byzantine Empire that survived disappeared in 1453 when the Turks delivered the coup de grace by capturing Constantinople.
You can imagine then how difficult it was for the people of Constantinople to live in a pot of honey when the land was full of wasps. Towards the end of the empire, the life of the average East Roman was a life of care. They were afraid of the ruthless tax collector, of the arbitrary tyranny of the imperial governor, of the devouring land hunger of the powerful, of the recurrent menace of barbarian invasion.
It's to the credit of the Byzantine world, to the credit of the tradition of Christian charity and social justice, which it often incorporated, that it realized this burden of fear and perennial danger and tried to lighten it by building hospitals for the sick, for lepers, for the disabled, by building hostels for pilgrims like these and strangers and old people, by building maternity homes for women and refuges for abandoned children and the poor, well-endowed institutions with elaborate charters telling just how they were to be administered. The Byzantines listened to the texts they heard in church, one of which inspired the future St. Anthony to become a hermit. If you would be perfect, go sell all you have and give to the poor, and come follow me. Many people followed this advice, and they did it the more readily since in the insecurity of their time, material goods could come and go very quickly anyway. Life was insecure and dangerous, and religious vocations, as well as outbreaks of violence and cruelty, were the natural consequence.
The world of our own time ought to make it easier for us to understand the passions of the Byzantine world, the problems it faced, the fears under which it labored, and the simple feat of endurance it performed. Because finally, that's what remains, the historic function of Constantinople as the outpost of Europe against the invading hordes of Asia. Under the shelter of that defense of its eastern gateway, Western Europe could refashion its own life. And it's hardly an exaggeration to say that the civilization of Western Europe is a byproduct of the will of the Byzantine Empire to survive.